Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to what will be the first of the Security Committee webinar series that we're taking place over the next 12 months. Some of you will remember we used to have a security summit. We've changed things up a little bit over the last year, and today is, to say, the inaugural session from the ATP Security Committee. My name is Paul Muir. I'm the chair of the Security Committee and also the Chief Customer Officer here at risr. And I'm delighted to be joined today by two colleagues who've come a very sort of long route to the assessment sector, as we'll all hear about over the next hour or so. I'd like them to introduce themselves. So, Harry, over to you.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon. My name is Harry Samit. I am the Director of Special Investigations for Pearson VUE. Did you want me to describe my route now?
Sorry, yeah, and then what was your previous role? Yeah, before you.
Yeah, okay. So I spent 9 years as an officer in naval intelligence and then another 21 years as an FBI special agent on the Minneapolis Joint Terrorism Task Force. And at the end of that time, I was looking around for another challenge, and I saw that Pearson was advertising for a law enforcement role. I applied and was lucky enough to be hired. I think the business was making some strategic moves in recognition of the fact that a lot of exam security constituted crime, criminal activity. So they were looking for a law enforcement person, and we found each other, and the rest is history of the last 6 years.
Over to you, Iain. Hi.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Iain Holland. I'm the Assessment Security Lead at Oxford University Press. I have a similar, though slightly shorter, work history to Harry, in that I worked on counterterrorism and national security in the UK government for 7 years before moving into private sector intelligence consultancy for about 2.5 years. I'm also a serving Army reservist in the Intelligence Corps in the British Army. Yes, I joined Oxford University Press in January this year. So I've only been in the assessment world for about 8 months now.
So I think for the audience, I think you can see we've got two very different, I guess, career trajectories to joining the assessment. I think a lot of people who've worked in this sector have been in this sector for a long time. Everyone knows everyone actually, and we thought what would be a great idea is to understand, using Harry and Ian's backgrounds, where they've come from, what brought them, into our industry, and what we can learn from them in our industry. Because I think, as we all recognise, commercial cheating, with whether that's with the use of AI or not with AI, other things are becoming a much more bigger issue within our sector. And one of the things we wanted to do is learn from people who have been dealing with, these large criminal gangs, and which effectively which is what commercial cheating is. As much as we like to try and I guess water it down a bit, I think it's only assessment, which is obviously not. I'm not saying assessment is really important, clearly, but people will think it's not that. It's not counterterrorism. It's not drugs, it's not something else. But actually, these are qualifications that are really important for immigration, for qualifications. Whether your doctor's qualified or not, whether your lawyer's qualified or not, your accountant, your teacher. There is a huge potential for misuse of qualifications, and obviously, what you guys have done over the last decades in national security, we can learn a lot from. So, just before we get into our questions, just for the audience, there is a Q&A button. We are going to have a session for Q&A towards the end. You can't actually talk to us physically, but you can put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom call or the Zoom webinar, and we'll get to some of those towards the end. But as I said, I think you both spent longer. I'm going to say Harry spent much longer than you, Iain. I'm going to be kind and say you look a bit younger than Harry. No disrespect, Harry, but I think you've done this a little bit longer. So you both spent decades in national security, and what first struck you as similar, working from obviously a security background and law enforcement backgrounds coming to test security? What was similar? I think, Iain, over to you for that.
Yeah, so the thing that struck me as very similar was actually that people cared about security. I spent 2.5 years in private kind of security and intelligence world, and there security is the afterthought. It's what you have to spend some money on because it's kind of a regulatory thing, something like that, or you spend a lot of money on it because something went horribly wrong at some point. But generally, until that happens, no one really cared. And then I came to test security, and suddenly people were really happy to see me. And they didn't try to cut me out of conversations, and they wanted my input on things. So that's the kind of big similarity that I saw, was how engaged people are in the security, and they understand how important it is.
And Harry, what was your perception? I say, when you, again, 21 years you said in the FBI, the Navy, counterterrorism. What's similar to that than to our English language test, for example, over this side?
I would say also the people that Ian brought up, but a little bit different shade on that. I find that the people, when especially in the FBI, you tend to think, because it's the United States' premier law enforcement agency on counterterrorism, which is what I worked. You tend to think of it as an elite. I tended to think of it as an elite organization with really good investigators. Came to the private sector, didn't know what to expect. But the team I joined here at Pearson were extremely skilled, highly motivated. I spent 30 years in government service. I didn't know what a private sector investigator would look like, and how they would operate. And I found that they're cut from the same cloth. They're highly motivated, they're very skilled, and it's really been gratifying working with people. If you ask me, I'll just preempt this, if you ask me what the most important quality in an investigator is, I would say it's intellectual curiosity. And the team here that I joined has every bit the same amount of that as any joint terrorism task force in the FBI.
I think you said there. I think it's the people side of it, and people were saying, there are links. Assessment isn't the same as counterterrorism, isn't the same as maybe drug enforcement, something like that. But what people have in this sector, in the sector I've been in for 25 years, is passion about what they do. So they want to protect it, and bring the experience that you and Ian and others, in your similar positions across the sector, are passionate about protecting those qualifications and what they mean for the candidates and the people who they may go on to use those qualifications for. So one of the things you talked about, and I think one of the things Harry, when we were prepping for this session, you talked about sort of these sort of steps of I guess investigation and sort of planning that are very similar, you think, from what you were doing previously when you came into here. So we talked about like crisis planning and response. Do you want to talk a bit about that? What's similar there?
I think from my time in the military and certainly in the bureau, from time to time, crises are going to arise, right? There's going to be situations that either in the severity of the issue or the time constraints, you're going to need to step through a fairly serious, progression of investigative measures. One of the things that they teach in the military that military staffs prepare for is panic, right? They factor out panic completely by having checklists and by having things scripted out, at least the initial few steps to kind of get you on track. And that's one of the things that you know I think I've introduced, at least in terms of Pearson's processes. Oftentimes we'll have an exam security matter come up. They're all serious. They're all taken very seriously. People sometimes are not used to crises, right? Your average private sector person doesn't face a lot of crisis like a counterterrorism type crisis, and so they're panicking. And one of the things that we use very aggressively now, just calming influences of the familiarity of stepping through some pre-designed staff work so that we make sure we hit all the wickets, we do everything that we need to do to get the case off and running, and really get people calmed down and reassured that we're going to work through this and reach a resolution.
Yeah, just to add to that, we have exactly the same approach, obviously, with the British military and British intelligence. It's often framed as reducing the cognitive load for the basic stuff. We don't want people to think, what does my email distro need to be? Who do I need to tell about this? That should already be prepared. You should already have a set list of who needs to be at that initial meetings. Those people may drop out once they've seen what the crisis is. Maybe it's not actually relevant to them. But if you are someone who does not organize crisis response on a regular basis or doesn't deal with it, let's take as much thinking out as possible so you can focus on things that actually need to be thought about, not the stuff that really could have been planned 6 months ago when you were drawing up your response plans.
I think some of that has definitely found its way through. I remember being a few years ago working with the provider when I was at British Council, and we did I think it was called a table exercise, which was similar to that. It sounds less glamorous. It doesn't sound quite as exciting when you call it a table exercise to what you guys used to do. But yeah, that was that. It was let's play through what happens if this happens, if this happens, this happens, and it wasn't just to do test security. It was around obviously everything, but an exam breach, if an exam breach happens, who do you tell? How do you tell them? When do you tell them? And who do you not want to know? Because that's some of the things actually you want to try and control the message, don't you, I guess?
Yeah, exactly. I will say as well, doing tabletop exercises, especially if you do them relatively regularly, you can make a crisis really boring when it actually happens. And that's the dream. You want everyone to be almost bored with what you're doing because you've done it before, the process is written down, you know exactly who you're talking to, you know how the meeting's meant to be structured. Reducing everything to a really boring state is a win, honestly.
Yeah, there's a saying in SWAT, in special weapons and tactics, that goes, that I'm sure people have heard it before, anybody who's played sports, but the idea is that the body can't go where the mind hasn't already been. And so you want to, to the best extent possible, you want to plan and prepare and train so that every eventuality that you can think of that could happen in the real world, you've at least thought through and trained for.
And I think obviously going off that, so we've done the planning, you've done the response, and so how do you again look thinking about what's similar from what your previous worlds to where we are now, investigating, what's going on. What tools have you seen that are being used across assessment and sort of law enforcement, or are there things that you used to do in law enforcement that we haven't quite figured out yet, or we're just not allowed to use because we're assessment people, not law enforcement people? So is there anything you can bring us on there?
Who's
I'm not
that
sure,
for?
Harry.
Okay.
I'll go to Harry first. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, so in terms of tools that are similar in both law enforcement worlds and exam security worlds, certainly social media search tools. Just like criminals and terrorists use social media, people who threaten exam security use social media. So those tools and the searches that we do are very similar. Some of the other capabilities, we cross over and we use undercover operations, both online and in person. We operate confidential human sources, snitches. We use those just like law enforcement. The area where we run into I won't say difficulty, but where the limits of our powers are really in the subpoena world. As a law enforcement officer, it was very easy for me if I had a criminal and I was able to prove that, to a judge or to a grand jury that, hey, this person is using this bank account or this credit card in furtherance of their crimes. It was easy to subpoena that information. That's something I really miss in the exam security world. If we had subpoena powers and capabilities like a law enforcement agency, we could solve a lot of our cases much more easily. So that's our biggest shortfall. That and the ability to conduct an in-person law enforcement type interview. We do use candidate interviews and even sometimes some bad guy interviews when we can, but we can't use it nearly as effectively as a law enforcement agency can.
Yes, law enforcement's ability to actually force people to engage I didn't realize how important that was until I no longer had it. But the other thing is that the most powerful tools I used in government were actually some of the most boring. I'm making my old job sound really boring here, but access to really basic data at scale. So identifying information and things like that. But that is also actually something you can carry over, is that you already will have, if you are delivering exams, you will have a lot of data on the people who are carrying out malpractice. Whether you are accessing that data, whether the investigators are accessing that data and understand it, is probably the most important thing to take away. Government has tools purpose-built to access a wide variety of databases simultaneously, obviously legally and ethically. I'd say the problem I've noticed more in the private sector is quite often that database is held somewhere and that information that's very useful is held, but either people can't access it because it's siloed, or they just don't really understand it or know it's there, so the investigators aren't using it. Once you realize how much you're holding internally, then you can go off and maybe start looking for the more exciting stuff, but that's your first step.
I guess one of the challenges we have in our sector as well is we have competing commercial organisations as well, and are there parallels there to, and obviously with that competing commercial organisations, maybe they don't want to share data or they can't share data because of different reasons. But is there a parallel to working across countries, working across different geographies where actually that's a similar challenge where you think you've got the data, you know who it is, but you can't share it?
Yeah, maybe not to the same extent as in criminal and terrorism cases. Certainly, despite its reputation, um, the FBI tends to be fairly forward-leaning on sharing terrorism information. We may not be able to pass it as quickly to certain countries as we'd like. It might have to go through certain administrative hurdles, but eventually, just in the interest of being ethical and having a duty to warn, it's pretty rare that we would have that the bureau would have information about a criminal or terrorism threat in a foreign country or pertaining to a foreign agency, and we wouldn't pass that. Almost without exception. I'm sure there are some exceptions. Whereas in the exam security world, like you say, it's a commercial marketplace, and we're not often given to helping our competitors, and so yeah, information sharing is a much different arrangement in any private sector industry as compared to governments.
I did get caught out with that early on when I contacted a competitor because I'd identified something, and the lawyers were not necessarily happy about that. But again, coming from that world where everyone talks about need to know, but need to share is generally the accepted principle, is that can I share this? And if so, who can I share it with? That's not how do I block this? So I would like to see more interaction, even if it's just on security, because it is something that generally I don't think we should be competing on. And also the same cheating rings that are targeting other organizations are targeting us and vice versa. They don't differentiate. The threat actors aren't differentiating between us. So it would be useful if we could be a bit more open. I don't know what mechanisms that would look like, and there are a lot of complexities, but the bang for your buck would be incredible in terms of what you could get out of it and how much effort individual organizations could save.
I think on the process thing, I think we're probably quite good as an industry because there are obviously like webinars like today, and we have the conference on test security that I know we're all engaged with in some way or another in the next couple of weeks. We have obviously the ATP Security Committee. We have other groups across the sector who are sharing our knowledge and ways we're doing things and what are the latest things we've found in terms of maybe tools and techniques that people are using. But as you say, we can't pick out and say we've met Iain Holland a little while ago and look what he's doing now. People don't. We're not really allowed to do that, I don't think. But I know it is a challenge, I think, and it potentially has dire consequences. We talked about before. If people are using this, and you've got someone who's a multi-time proxy tester or something who we all know is going across the world doing this, it's very difficult to spot them and to just share that data. Is there So we sort of looked at crisis planning. We looked at the idea of that you plan for it. You can use different tools for investigation. What happens sort of post investigation? What are again the similarities around? You've done an investigation. Obviously what you can do again in your old worlds versus what you can do here is, I guess, very different. I don't know if Iain, I'll go first.
Yeah, I mean, I tried to get the police to kick down their door in my first malpractice investigation, and that was shut down pretty quickly. But I think you just have to be maybe a little more creative coming into this world and realize that your objective is not actually to punish people who cheat. It is to maintain the integrity of the tests, and therefore your actions can do that. You may not actually be able to punish the test taker. They are possibly going to be able to run off and get another certificate from a different organization that's less security or just are unlucky and get through it. But you can take steps to maintain the integrity by stripping results, by barring people. And where you can, sharing it with other test takers and testing organizations in the same space. Say, this person has carried out this malpractice. Maybe you can't be that specific, or this is the kind of malpractice we're seeing in this area, to try and maintain the integrity across the board. It just has to be a bit more creative. How can we actually achieve our objectives without necessarily having those powers that we're used to having?
Yeah, in terms of what happens when an investigation is concluded, the parallels between law enforcement and exam security are nearly 100% in this case. When I was an agent, um, we would eventually finish an investigation, and we would take the information that we obtained and split it really into two. One side would be intelligence, which we would use to protect ourselves, right? We would, a great example is the shoe bomber case, of 2001, right? Richard Reed was a subject, got on a transatlantic flight, had a bomb in his shoe. And so for the next, 25 years, the flying public had to take their shoes off. Well, the intelligence derived from that case was used to bolster airline security, and that's one example. And then the evidence from that case was used to prosecute Richard Reed and ultimately sentence him to life in prison. And so we do the exact same thing with exam security, in that we derive intelligence about how the bad guys act, and we use that to improve our technology and our operational procedures, right? We make our test centers and our online proctors aware of what the bad guys are doing. We take that intelligence that we collect, and we make our defenses better. And then in those cases where we can take the evidence, we take the evidence and we give it to our clients, and we say, okay, here's the case, here's what happened, here's how the candidates cheated, and then our clients can take action, that's consistent with their misconduct policy, their malpractice policy. We do, like I say, we do exactly the same things in terms of intelligence and evidence that our counterparts in law enforcement and the government security agencies are doing now.
Yeah, just to build on that, and especially the intelligence bit, it is worth baking in the lessons learned to the process, not just having it as something that we kind of think we should do, but a concrete step that someone is responsible for every investigation. Maybe that's not something, a serious kind of half-day exercise. Maybe it's just someone at some point needs to go, are there lessons we can learn from this? Even if just 10 minutes of conversation about that, but that needs to be actually in the process rather than something that's kind of wishy-washy somewhere that we'll do at some point.
And also, I'll add, sorry, Paul, I just want to add one more thing. It also calls for internal collaboration, right? If my team strictly took that intelligence and said, wow, we sure learned a lot about how proxy testers operate, we're going to put that in the file and sit on it, then the business as a whole wouldn't benefit. And so we talk to product ownership, and we talk to operations, and we talk to technology, we talk to all of the internal teams and get them to come along on this security journey with us, so that when we discover a new technique that the bad guys are using, our colleagues are motivated to come up with countermeasures, and they get excited about it.
So that's something that you see law enforcement do quite well, is putting their hands up and say, something went wrong here, or we weren't up to scratch on this, and this is what we've learned on it, which is effectively what we're doing there. We say, okay, we actually didn't have a process that captured this. That was an error on our part, and this is how we're changing it, or going out to stakeholders saying, how can we fix this? But there isn't really room for an ego. It can be quite embarrassing, especially when you realize you have made a mistake, which I have made plenty of mistakes over my career. But taking lessons learned and publishing them is very important once those have happened.
I guess that's also we touched on it earlier on, when you're both of you, come from government backgrounds where also if things go wrong, there are still significant consequences if they do go wrong. But in a commercial sense, as you say, do you admit something's gone wrong? Because actually that could tank your sales, your share price. It could reveal something. So there are things that sometimes you can say and can't say in a commercial world, where you want to say, actually, we found this loophole that someone's been able to use or something. But actually, you want to say that, because actually that shows, particularly, does that call in question all the other exams that came before you? So there's a whole sort of tiptoeing here, I guess, in the commercial world, which is very different from a government world?
Yes, that is. I mean, I would focus on the internal, and I have done in my last job. I did a presentation on all of the mistakes I've made in my first year, and it was very well attended because everyone obviously found that quite hilarious. But that was internal. We would not kind of be in a position. I don't think I could have got backing to do that externally. You're right. You have to be very careful what you share. It is good to be very open and to be as open as you can. I think if you are going to share when something went wrong, you better have it publicly. You probably do need to be able to say exactly how you fixed it.
But I guess, Harry, one of the things we talked about as well when we were doing this prep was sometimes people mistakenly thinking that test security is more about cybersecurity as well, which is, I think you were saying, is a mistake.
Yeah, I mean, there is certainly a heavy cybersecurity component to a lot of the threats that we see, particularly in the online proctored world, remotely invigilated world. But that being said, much like any other criminal investigation, there's a human component and a technology component. We have divided things at Pearson. We've divided things that way, where my team primarily handles investigation of, human heavy threats, and then we have a cybersecurity team that handles cybersecurity threats, and we work hand in glove. The director of that team and I are in daily contact, hourly contact. Sometimes the lines are blurred, but I think just addressing one or the other, just addressing the people component and just addressing the technology component separately doesn't give you the full picture. You have to look at it both ways.
Yeah, just because we have a very similar setup, and that divide between cyber and human is because of the technical skills required on the investigator side. It's not because threats are divided into cyber and human. Threats are blurry. Threats don't care how you label them. So it's important to remember that the enemy doesn't necessarily align to our own doctrine of how we separate these things. And it's very easy to fall into that trap of, oh, this is a cyber actor. They probably don't think of themselves as a cyber actor, or this is a human actor. It's like, well, they're probably using a computer at some point, right? So yeah, that's a blur. That's a line that we put in place rather than the enemy. Sorry, the test takers, not the enemy.
The internal versus external wording again, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
I think when we talk about security in any context, are there any other sort of common principles that apply whether we're protecting a nation, as you guys used to do, versus whether you're protecting an exam? What else can we do? We've talked about crisis planning, investigations, post. So what else are sort of common principles you can apply to this world? Okay, Harry?
Well, I've already talked about intellectual curiosity, I think, being the key quality. I would say closely behind that is being vigilant. It's one thing to be intellectually curious, but you have to constantly have that turned on, and you have to be doing that all the time. We have fielded a whole array in the last 2 or 3 years with the help of our product ownership teams and our operations teams. We've fielded a whole array of really proactive, aggressive techniques and systems to not just wait for the threats to come to us, but to go out looking for them. And so, much like, government intelligence and government, security work, I think you have to be proactive and you have to be vigilant in the exam security world. You can't wait for the bad guys to come to you. You got to go looking for them.
I think what I bring in is the creativity, that this is not static. Counterterrorism wasn't static. Even I was only in that world for 7 years, and things changed a lot in that time. And test security obviously changes very quickly, especially on the technical side. So if we are going to try and keep these things secure, we need to be creative in how we manage those threats, the mitigations we put in place, how we investigate things, and how we protect the integrity. We cannot use last year's playbook. We can't use the playbook from 6 months ago because things have changed. Even if it's just internally, your business has probably changed in the last 6 months. The way you deliver tests or the tests themselves has changed. So continual creativity to find new ways to fix the problem.
And that's one of the things they actually teach at Quantico. I don't know at the FBI Academy. I don't know if you could teach creativity, if you could teach someone to be creative, or if it's an innate characteristic. But I will say, interestingly, when I was in the very first training classes to learn to be an agent, it's one of the things the instructors brought up right away, that within the law, you're expected to be as creative as you can be to solve these threats, these crimes, because of course the bad guys are going to be, right, that in a lot of cases their livelihood or their personal safety is wrapped up in their creativity, and they're finding new ways to do business. On the security and investigation side, we have to be equally creative.
Yeah, and we also got training that, I will say, when in a training scenario, sometimes there's only so creative you can be. I came up with some very creative ideas in training scenarios, and I was taken aside and told, that's a great idea, but you'll break the scenario if we do that. So we're going to move on. But it is that you don't necessarily have to follow the proven routes. The legal within, I say, there's some wiggle room within legal, so it makes it sound really dodgy, but there's a lot you can do within the legal realm or within your malpractice that is creative. You don't necessarily have to go down the strict malpractice routes that you've gone down previously, or the ones you usually go down.
I think it's about, you say creativity, it's that sort of inquisitive mind, isn't it? It's about asking. I'm someone who likes to ask why, and I've got two small children who like to ask why a lot as well, for different reasons. But I think it is sort of trying to push that boundary and saying, well, why are we doing this? What's the, and asking, why can't we do it another way? I think a lot of these things, because again, sometimes it's a bit like we talk about whack-a-mole, I think, in test security as well. Do you think you've solved it, and then up pops another way of cheating, a different way, something we haven't thought of before, and it, you feel like you're starting again. And is there anything in terms of national security? Obviously, most people call in help after something's gone wrong. So you tend to turn. I guess there's sometimes you can do a lot of the work you do with actually trying to stop something happening to begin with. But actually, a lot of time people come in, it's an after the event thing. So is there anything that organizations can do better to prepare to sort of prevent those crisis calls? And we've touched on a few things before, I know, but I don't know, Harry, sort of building on sort of the crisis point you were talking on, is there anything else we can do as testing organizations to make sure we're ready?
But one of the things that I'm a big proponent of, and I recommend whenever I speak with clients about this, have a person designated. So thinking about the problem, they say defining the problem is halfway to solving it. But I notice, especially a lot of smaller exam sponsors oftentimes don't really have a designated security person. Some of the bigger ones, obviously the ones that are threatened, have a whole exam security team, and that's good. They're constantly thinking about it and coming up with doctrine and policy. That's terrific. But the smaller ones, smaller programs that aren't as heavily threatened by exam security issues, oftentimes they don't have anybody. And when they have a crisis, it's like, who works on this? Oh, well, Paul and Iain, there are security people. We bring them in when there's a problem. My recommendation is, even if it's a person that has another duty, that has other duties and has a different job, make them in peacetime, if you will, in the time between crises, make them your designated security person, so they start thinking about it now, so that you have at least one person who, within the constraints of your resources, is the expert in that. And just beginning to think about that and internalize that, and having one person who has the hammer on security, is a really good first step for when that crisis comes.
Yeah, I'd agree. I generally follow the principle that if no one is named next to a job, then that job isn't getting done. If you come out of a meeting and you had an action point and no one's name's against it, that's never getting done. Everyone's busy. I think the other one is training that person, or hopefully your entire team, to actually recognize you are in a crisis, so that you don't get called in once the crisis is done and it's too late to mitigate anything and your test has been leaked all over the internet. So we use red teaming, where we actually have them play the part of criminals, and we set a framework and we have them break into the test through a series of structured analytical techniques. But part of the value of that was, we understood some new threats, some new ways people could take advantage of our tests. But the bigger one is, I had a dozen people there who now have a better understanding of, oh, these are the kind of things that will happen, and this is when I should call Iain. Because the biggest thing is not necessarily that kind of isn't just, sorry, that they call you in after, it's that they could call you in a lot earlier, but they don't recognize how badly things are going right now. And they're going to spend a day, 2 days, 3 days trying to work out whether they need to call you. But in reality, if they called you at that first hint of trouble, everything would have been a lot easier.
Well, I guess this is where the difference between your previous roles potentially and where we are now. Do you say if you haven't got someone named in that role, that's first little nugget of information that might look completely innocent by itself. When you start to add that into something else, to something else, to something else, I imagine that's where, I guess, if you haven't got full focus, you're missing those pieces of jigsaw building up, aren't you?
Yeah,
Yeah,
and the
exactly.
real problem is, to Ian's point, you can, if you don't have someone who is at least your security expert, and expert is a variable term, then you could have three chickens with their heads cut off running around in the first few hours or days of a crisis, and not really, moving the ball at all. And so, you want to have your plans in place, you want to have your people named. And also, it tends to be easier, like Ian said, if you have one person who is your expert, when they know, okay, now it's time to call in, the professionals. Now it's time to call in the people who do this every day. All of that just happens more quickly if you have someone thinking about it in advance.
And I know we have got some questions coming in, which I'm gonna sort of try and filter in as we go through, because I think one of them is quite actually sort of links into now. So Michelle has asked us a question here, and I'll come to Harry first on this. It says, as issues are discovered, maybe with our program or with another organization, do you work with the rest of your clients to ensure proper protocols are in place to protect their IP? So I guess that comes to what we were talking about earlier on. How much can you share between programs or what's been discovered, I guess, with
Yeah.
the other clients?
So there's definitely a very strict siloing among clients, right? They don't want their data shared, and we respect that, of course, but that doesn't prevent us from synthesizing and sanitizing the material and sharing it that way. So we will get a client's permission and say, hey, we want to take all references to your program out of this, but we want to share this across our entire client base. It's one of the advantages we have of having, 500 plus clients, is we see so many different, methodologies by the bad guys. So sharing is one thing. We share sanitized versions of threat information all the time. But more importantly, internally, we don't have to sanitize anything, right? We can share with our internal teams and tell them the full story so that they can bolster our defenses. But, that's a real advantage. We get to see the good, the bad, and the ugly across so many different programs.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. It's how much you can share. It's why we touched on it earlier on, why we have sessions like this, and why we have the conference on test security and other things where we can come together and share ideas, blog posts, LinkedIn. Obviously, following you on LinkedIn as well, Harry. You see obviously things which are obviously some are assessment based and some are very much from your old world as well, where you talk about what things you've done and what can be done as well. I think so we're sort of moving these things forward. I think with one of the questions we talked about was, investigations, and that we talked about earlier on, it's sort of relying on evidence and motive and behavior. But what principles, the sort of counterterrorism or criminal investigation, can strengthen how we investigate test fraud on this side of the fence? I don't know, Ian, if you want to take that first.
Yeah, so it's a very broad one, but it is something I've noticed in counterterrorism, and I also am seeing it when people talk about investigations in this world, is that the people you are investigating are smart, motivated, and in their minds, they are justified and acting rationally. From the outside perspective, it might look like a terrible idea, but internally, they are rational. It's very easy when you're working security, I suppose to everyone, and it's a hallmark of groupthink, to begin to see the enemy as stupid and that they get through by luck. When in reality, if you approach every investigation like, this person is smart, this person has acted in a way that to them is rational, and they have decided that the benefits of cheating outweigh the risks, it's going to help you identify malpractice more effectively. It's also going to help you by understanding that your opponent is not an idiot and that they are very much human. Then it's going to allow you to carry that investigation more effectively, because if we start slipping into this person's an idiot, and I hear it's a lot in the rhetoric, partly it's lighthearted, like, oh, these scumbags who cheat, and But it's quite a dangerous way of thinking, because then you stop respecting that this person is intelligent and has potentially done something very clever.
I think to your point on that, it is we talked about it. We talked cheating rings. We talked about commercial cheating. This isn't someone potentially this one person sitting in their bedroom thinking, "How can I help one person cheat?" This potentially is on a huge scale, and I know there's a lot of work. People like Rachel Schoenig with the Credential Integrity Alliance have been doing some work around how can we help lawmakers recognize this as a huge problem and actually try and get laws put in place. Which actually, I think there's a question we'll come to in a minute from one of the attendees who have talked about how do you make what you're doing legal, I guess. So one of the questions, and I'll come to it and we can come around to it, is actually says, have you ever received pushback from legal counsel when trying to conduct an investigation? Which I'm not gonna guess the answer. I'll go to Harry first, but I can guess the answer, but go on.
Yes. The short answer to that is yes. Look, can I just go back to the previous question, not to hijack
Yeah,
the
go.
webinar? I just wanted to answer on the bad guys. Ian has a good point. You can't underestimate your enemy. The way we look at it is, um, you know, exam security cheating rings, commercial cheating rings have to accomplish three things. They have to accomplish marketing, right? They have to get in touch with their customers, candidates, and sell them their services. They have to find some way of collecting payment, right? There has to be a monetary transaction so they can receive income for their services. And then they have to be able to accomplish what they claim, right? Proxy testing or content harvesting. And so we are looking at ways to disrupt those three things: marketing, payment, and accomplishing what they say. We're looking to disrupt all three of those things with web monitoring and enforcement to take out their social media, with enforcement to target their payment mechanisms, and then with the holistic exam security thing to prevent them from being able to proxy test or content harvest. And if we can attack those three critical functions, any one of those three disrupts them, but we try and go after all of them. To your question about legal, yes, it is my impression, it was in the government and it is in the corporate world, that lawyers tend to be risk averse. They tend to fear, very abstract, unlikely outcomes. And so, yep, getting through legal is one of my daily challenges.
Yeah, I think it's perhaps a slightly different. I found it slightly different here than in civil service, where the lawyers were probably very educated. Well, they were very educated on what we were doing, counterterrorism, what we'd done before. I'd say perhaps it may be different in other organizations, but we don't have a lawyer who just deals with malpractice. So things to them may look a little scary, whereas they're routine for us. And part of that is when I need to get something by the lawyers, taking a step back and not assuming any knowledge. And that does save time. I'm not saying it's always super easy. The lawyers have their job, and I appreciate that. But taking that approach of, hold on, let's assume this person knows nothing about malpractice and work from there does save me a lot of time.
So just following that line of thought there. So Kathy's got a question and in the chat that says, what rules govern interviews of test users suspected of misconduct by companies versus the rules for law enforcement personnel? So do you have rules? I think, Harry, we talked about this before, about something around these sort of non-intrusive ways of trying to conduct some of these things. But do you want to try and answer that first?
Yeah, so obviously the law is the law, in terms of things that we're not allowed to do, right? We're not allowed to hack the bad guys. We're not allowed to, record them without their consent in two-party states. There's lots of broad legal techniques that we're not allowed to do, right? We're not allowed to steal from them. We're not allowed to do lots of those things. And that's the same for law enforcement, right? There's just limitations on what any agency, investigative agency, whether it's a government one or a corporate one, can do. And we obviously steer well clear of anything illegal there. But then there's also the idea that within the realm of effectiveness, right? We have to still be effective and we have to still be impactful. And so sometimes, our team reaches its limits, either in terms of geography or techniques that we can employ, and then we use third-party vendors. We also make sure we don't assume, that third-party vendors are aware. We spell out parameters on what's legal and what's not legal for them as well. But we make sure that we are respecting the law when we do investigations, while still, hopefully achieving our goals.
And I guess someone like Pearson, where you're working across 140 odd countries as well, you're then having to navigate what's applicable in not Australia versus the US, aren't you, as well? You have to try, because that, I guess, restricts you what you can do.
Sure, and for that we rely on local counsel, right? We're never going to take a leap of faith and say, oh well, it's legal in the United States. We'll just assume it's legal in Australia. We rely on local counsel to definitely give us the guardrails.
Just to be clear, I've got nothing against Australia either. That's the first thing. It began with A and it came to my mind. So, um, I think one of the things we talked about is another thing around this is if after there's been a breach or some kind of cheating incident, what can organizations do to sort of move beyond fixing the immediate issue to actually learning from it and improving their systems? Because again, the natural thing is to say, oh, this was the breach, this was the issue, we'll fix it. And actually, what you've missed is the sort of seven things that probably led to that thing happening. So, Iain, what can you tell us from, again, your previous life? What would you do? What could you bring across to the testing world?
Yeah, I think that instinct to just fix the problem that exists everywhere because people are busy and it can be a bit embarrassing. A few things. One is have set time aside to carry out a root cause analysis, kind of go through, okay, yeah, that was the exact methodology they used, but what allowed that to occur? And you can keep tracing back, and I'd recommend people research different structured analytical techniques that you can use for things like this, even if it's just a series of questions that you ask yourself, like, has this caused other breaches, other security failings elsewhere? Who owns this process? Which quite often you'll find no one owns this process if there's been a failure, which is something that often gets missed. Even if it's just a series of questions that you have to ask yourself every time this happens, that's the kind of thing that can help you move past just fixing the issue to actually identifying whether there is a root cause, or if you are going to say this was actually an anomaly or something like that, that you can say that with confidence and in a way that's recorded, and will give people kind of a degree of confidence that you are not just brushing this into the carpet, you have considered it. Backcasting and things like that, and root cause analysis of the things. Or really simple, just keep asking yourself, so what? Just, this went wrong, so what? And just keep asking yourself that till you run out of ideas, and it will force you to think about what actually went wrong here rather than the surface level issues.
I think one of the things we talked about, Harry, when we again prepping for the session, one of the quote, I'll call it a quote. I'll quote from you. So I think I wrote down, people want manuals. People are human beings feel very comfortable if they've got a document in front of them. They can hold it and go, this is what we should be doing, and it says so. And then is that something you found true of, whether from old world versus new world, that people like big books of stuff? You're on mute, Harry. Sorry.
When I got to the FBI Academy, a long time ago, as you've both observed, I'm old. There were still paper manuals, and so the very first day at Quantico, we got issued just tremendously tall stacks of binders, that were the MAOP and the MIOG and all the FBI guidebooks on how to conduct an investigation. And when I dug into those and I started reading them as I was required to for training, one of the things I realized is it wasn't so much checklists like it had been in the military telling you what to do. It was more things that you weren't allowed to do. And then anything that wasn't in the MIOG or the MAOP or the two main manuals for the FBI was fair game. And so kind of the way I boiled it down for myself and I internalized it is that all these investigative techniques that we use, undercover operations, informants, tip lines, psychometrics, they are all approved investigative tools in the toolbox. And so I approach every exam security case the same way I would approach, a broken engine in my car. And if I could see that it was the fuel injectors and I needed to take off, the fuel injector cover with a screwdriver, I would reach for the screwdriver. Well, it's the same with an exam security problem. And so when I got to Pearson, people wanted me to write a manual. Let's have an investigative manual. And I said, that just wasn't my tradition, right? Except for manuals to forbid you from doing certain things that were illegal or unethical or violated attorney general guidelines. Everything else, to use Iain's word, everything else that's not forbidden under creativity is fair game. And so apply those tools to the exam security problem the same way you would use them to fix the engine on your car if it's broken.
Yeah, we actually used to call, when people tried to produce documents like that, we call it investigating by numbers. We were always very dismissive because you can't actually provide a perfect manual that will cover it. And if you do, you're just going to do the same investigation every time, and all that creativity has disappeared. So there is definitely value in those manuals, especially if you've got people doing stuff on an irregular basis, like crisis management or even investigations. If you have, depending on your organization, investigations may be owned by a team and it's not their entire job. But it's just, if you are creating a manual, don't give the impression that manual is a Bible. This is not dogma. It is a guide within which you can operate. And maybe I've actually not heard that one, Harry, about tell people what they can't do. And that gives them lots of room to work out what they can do. That's quite a good one. I might steal that, actually. That might be a better way to do it. It's like, these are your objectives. These are things we're not allowed to do. Off you go.
And we want to differentiate. I want to be clear to differentiate, because we started this webinar by saying you have to have checklists for when there's a crisis. That's true. That's different from how you investigate. So, you've become aware of an exam security issue. People are panicking. You do need a checklist. You do need a manual for immediate action, for immediate steps in response to the crisis. What we're talking about then is how you investigate it. There's no real manual for how to investigate. Just use your tools.
I know we're coming up to the last 10 minutes or so. A few more questions. If anyone else is on the webinar has got any more questions for Harry or Iain, do pop them into the chat. One of the questions that just come up, I think it's slightly linked to what we've been talking about here, is Baracus, who one of my ex-colleagues from British Council actually, has said human threats remain one of the biggest drivers of security and malpractice risks. Since most malpractice incidents require some level of human collusion, what practical measures can be implemented to effectively mitigate these threats? I don't know if Iain or Harry, who wants to take that first?
That's a very difficult question, just because it's going to be so dependent on the nature of your tests and how you're delivering. But I think the biggest one is, first of all, identifying that it is human driven. And one of the ways that we focus on is making elements of our security very visible, in order to kind of mitigate. The best thing to do is not to catch someone cheating. The best thing to do is to convince them they're not going to get away with cheating, so they don't do it. So publicizing security measures or publicizing capabilities, you can be a bit vague. Best not to be too specific, because if you provide too much information, they can identify countermeasures. But creating a very visible security network or security framework that is going to put them off is probably, that's my go-to, because I'd always rather people just didn't try than I have to do my practice investigation.
Yeah. As a layperson in this as well, from my perspective, is this similar to, like, if you go to an airport, and you walk through the security scanner, you know that there's a big thing that's going to look at you and you're going to see what's going on. You know that at some point you're walking through that and it's going to see what's on you. So again, you haven't told them how you're doing it. But there's a very, very physical thing that says, we're going to do something to you here that's going to try and highlight something.
Yeah, and there's a big box that your luggage goes through and magically shows what's inside. And people do understand these. Just to be clear, I don't think X-rays are magic or something. But the point is, you don't really necessarily understand their capabilities, and different airports have different capabilities in different countries. But there is this big, scary security hole that you're going to have to go through with lots of people, and those people might be armed in some countries. And that, it's called security theatre, though I don't like that term, is really effective. And it forces them it raises that barrier to attempting malpractice if they can look at your security and go, that looks really scary.
I
I
think
would
some.
also add I would
Sorry.
also add the candidate agreement. I think people, we have started to emphasize the importance of candidate agreements as a security tool. I think some clients really embrace that. I think more should. The candidate agreement from a security perspective really should have three roles, but whether you're delivering online or in a test center, one is to educate the candidate to threats. Tell them if you do engage in cheating, you're risking exposure. You may be colluding with criminals who don't have loyalty to you, but to themselves. The second portion is, you secure their agreement to cooperate with an investigation moving forward. You want to say something along the lines of, hey, you know, if we find something anomalous with your exam, we're going to investigate, and you're agreeing to cooperate with that investigation so that later the candidates can't say, well, I don't want to talk to you and I don't want to participate. And then the third part is warn them of the consequences, right? And, tell them, you're going to suffer consequences for cheating. And that no matter where you deliver, whether it's online or in a test center, that candidate agreement focuses specifically on the person, and it's getting that person to agree to certain, stipulations that you're insisting upon.
I think the point around the consequences is really interesting because I think people in the normal world outside of testing as well are very much aware that if you speed in your car, there are consequences which equal X, Y, Z. And I think we're very not necessarily the best at that in assessment, actually telling that. And I remember at a security summit, probably about 4 years ago now, we had a professor come in from one of the London universities and talked about his research into consequences and people not realizing that if you're maybe a practicing lawyer or a doctor, actually, you think, actually, I'm just cheating. It's only, what is it? I'm going to get a few extra marks. Actually, no, what you're doing actually is you're throwing away your career. If you get caught, you're not just cheating and failing your test, you're potentially losing your license and things like this. So I think it's interesting that that sort of consequences element is maybe not laid on enough because if you know the real consequences of doing it, actually, it might stop you doing the other things to begin with. We're in the final few minutes. A final question to both of you, if there's a really sort of 1, 2 line answer for this. If there's one lesson from your years in sort of national security and intelligence that every test security professional on our side of the world, our side of the fence, should understand and should try and adopt, what would it be? And it could be something we've already said, or it could be something completely different. What would you say one thing we should try and adopt is?
I'll jump in with the first one. Yeah. And
Go
I think it's potentially a slight shift in mindset. The worst thing that can happen will happen. And with counterterrorism, it did happen. And you need to get over that mental barrier. And that allows you to actually, one, operate more freely, work more effectively towards dealing with that. But it also is a great message to take to your stakeholders that I said in my first month, there will be a cataclysmic security failure during my time here, and we need to be prepared to deal with that. And people need to understand that we are not flawless, and something will happen. Real downer to end on there, but
I would say, for my part, panic kills. Do not panic. Unfortunately I see it from time to time where an inexperienced, from a security perspective, client encounters a crisis. I don't know if I'd go so far as Ian's term cataclysmic, but a serious security crisis. I've had people say, I haven't slept in 3 nights. I'm freaking out. I don't know what I'm going to do. Um, you know, having obviously it's easy for me to say because I've been through dozens and dozens and potentially hundreds of these, but everything is going to be okay. And the sooner you get to that mindset, the sooner, no matter how serious the situation looks, the sooner you arrive at everything's going to be okay and we are going to master the situation, the sooner you're going to be able to move forward aggressively and resolve it. And so panic kills in a crisis situation. Get control of yourself and start taking, concrete steps to resolve the problem.
I think that's a very good note to end on there. I think Harry said everything's going to be okay. That's a quote. We heard that. It's recorded as well, so we can play that back whenever anyone's panicking. Little gif of Harry saying everything's going to be okay. That's. I think we've fixed it there. Thank you again, Harry and Ian, both for your time today and sharing your stories, your anecdotes from your previous worlds into what is now very much your day-to-day life in assessment. And thank you for everyone for joining us. This is, as I said, is the first of a series of webinars that we're going to be doing, not just with Harry and Iain, much to their relief, over the next year on security topics. So if anyone has any requests for what you'd like to see in the next few webinars, please let us know through the ATP email. If you haven't already registered for it, and we have the Innovations Conference in New Orleans on the 1st to the 4th of March next year, registration is now open. And all I can say again is we will try and also be doing a small blog post off the back of this webinar as well for people to, some of the questions we couldn't answer live here because we've run out of time. So if you've got anything you'd like to ask us, please be in touch. And I think I always say on these things, this is a continuing conversation. It doesn't end at 5 o'clock wherever you are in the world or midday. This is something that we keep doing. The Security Committee is here to help share ideas. We're all there to help share ideas. And I think we've all touched on that a number of times. Harry and Iain have said it's about sharing what we can when our lawyers let us, I think is the best way to finish it. But as I said, let's end with Harry says everything will be okay. And thanks again for listening.